Welcome back, everyone. It is Eric from Candy, and today we're going to be checking out what decks have been winning in Japan for the month of June. Now, I will say there have been actually a ton of tournaments happening, including their giant national championship, but I think that tournament specifically has already been pretty well covered by the community at this point. And instead of focusing on that format, I'm actually going to look ahead and focus in on the decks that are going to be featuring cards from the new Pokemon Card 151 set. So these decks that we're going to be checking out today have been winning local, smaller shop tournaments. So think of the size of like a league challenge or like a league cup. These aren't going to be the giant, 3,000 person tournaments like their nationals. But again, I think these are probably the more interesting decks to take a look at to maybe get a bit of a sneak peek to what we can expect whenever this set does finally drop internationally. But if you guys didn't notice, PokemonCard.io is the site here we're going to be using for this. They do a great job of compiling all of these tournament results on a weekly basis. So there's actually going to be a ton of other decks that we're not even going to get around to covering today. So if you guys want to see all of the decks that have been winning for the month of June, I'll be sure to have a link down below in the description for you to check out the rest of the winners. But with that being said, guys, remember to smack that like button for me, feed that always hungry YouTube algorithm, and let's jump in and check out what decks have been winning over in Japan for the month of June. So today we're going to start off with some of the older established archetypes that are getting some updates from this new Pokemon Card 151 set. And as you can see, we have a winning Mew VMAX list. And I think at a glance, this looks like very standard sort of DTE Mew, but the big new inclusion here is the Snatch Arm, which I do think is pretty interesting. It's an item where you play it from your hand and then you look at your opponent's hand and you choose a Pokemon you find there and put it at the bottom of their deck. So I think the idea here is this card is like an always burnable -1 for your hand size to be able to draw more cards with Genesect. But, the big play we see all the time with DTE Mew is Judge Path or Ionopath. You're trying to do this every turn, limit your opponent's options. So if you can go like Judge Path, then Snatch Arm, and maybe even remove one of the cards that was remaining in your opponent's hand, that could be big at leaving your opponent with maybe just a 3-card hand at that point. Or even in the early game, if you open with this, not even a bad card, because if your opponent has something like a Lumineon in hand that they are going to be relying on for next turn, you can just put that at the bottom of their deck. How did they find space for this? It looks like they've barely cut anything out of here. But yeah, the Snatch Arm seems cool. There's definitely a few decks trying this thing out, so we'll have to see if this might be the way to play DTE Mew going forward. So next up, we have a single strike Lugia list here, and I think at a glance, this looks very standard, but hiding behind the Squawkabilly EX over here, we actually have a copy of Mew EX, which seems to be a card that a lot of these Lugia lists are including now, whether it's the colorless version or the single strike version. This card is making its way into so many different Lugia decks that are winning over there. And to be honest, I'm not sure if there's like one specific reason Mew is in the deck for, but I can definitely see it serving a couple of different roles in the deck. One reason is that it has free retreat. That's one thing Lugia's never really had before, is like a good pivot Pokemon. But Mew's ability also does let you draw until you have 3 cards in your hand, so maybe this is just to Iono-proof you in the late game. But also Mew, it has a colorless attack, so you can, in theory, power this thing up and attack with it. I believe it's you copy one of the attacks on your opponent's active Pokemon and use it as this attack. Now, to be fair, I'm actually not sure what we're attempting to copy here. Like, the only thing I can really think of is maybe if you're going against like Rapid Strike Urshifu or Single Strike Urshifu, your deck really doesn't have a great way at answering one of those Pokemon with a one-shot. So Mew does give you the option to do that. So if we do expect Rapid Strike Urshifu and Single Strike Urshifu to continue to be very popular, this definitely could give you an edge in those matchups. But again, I'm not sure if there's like one specific reason for the Mew, or if it's just, again, sort of an all-around solid card that provides a number of different options for your deck. But speaking of Mew EX, we have a really interesting deck here that really caught me off guard. We have Mew EX with Pikachu V-Union. And actually, this isn't the only one that was winning. There was a few of these actually getting dubs over there in Japan. And I think at a glance, it makes sense because Pikachu, it's lightning, it's weak to fighting. So if you go against something like an Urshifu, Mew EX can sort of fix that matchup for you and, give you an answer to those different fighting Pokemon. Again, that was my knee-jerk reaction, but Electric Generator can't power up Mew, and there's really not a great way to actually attack with Mew here, so maybe they're just using Mew for the engine here. These actually do stack, so if you have 2, 3, or even 4 Mew EX in play, you can just keep turboing through your deck, and that's on top of the Squawkabilly That's on top of Articuno, on top of Radiant Greninja, and even outside of their Pokemon, they also have the 4 trekking shoes and the Pokestops that just keep churning through their deck to discard these Pikachu V-Union pieces as soon as possible. 2 Ionos, the only draw supporter in the entire deck, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. I mean, I guess the Adventurous Discovery and Peonia do offer you ways at seeing additional cards, but very odd draw engine that we have here. And if you guys do need a refresher on Pikachu V-Union, it actually is a pretty decent attacker. Has a couple of interesting attacks, but the big one is 150 plus item lock for 3 energy. So they can't play their rare candies, their superior energy retrievals, their switch cards, escape ropes, whatever they might need. Item lock is pretty good, especially once you tack on a pretty hefty amount of damage that you're doing along with it. Oh, and I guess what I was saying about not being able to attack with Mew isn't totally correct here. They do have the 2 copies of EXP share. I didn't notice these. So maybe the theory is you get a couple of these down on your Mews, and in the mid game, if your opponent does start to threaten like an Urshifu or something like that, you can siphon a couple of lightning energies over to your Mews, get these guys powered up to maybe deal with these different psychic weak Pokemon. Yeah, that's really the only way I could see that working. But if you can avoid getting like Judge Pathed or something like that by Mew or like Arceus or something, this engine actually does look really cool. So very curious to try out the Pikachu deck whenever UEX releases overseas here. And as you guys can see, we're slowly inching more and more into these new archetypes from the Pokemon 151 set. And this is going to be with Charizard EX and the Pokemon Go Charizard. So Charizard EX actually has a couple of decent attacks. The first one, I believe, is 60 plus 100 if you have damage counters on Charizard. So obviously Magma Basin powers that thing up. But the second attack is 4 fire, does 330, and I think you discard 3 energy. So normally that would be honestly kind of an unmanageable attack cost, even with Raihan, even with Magma Basin. But with the Pokemon Go Charizard that doubles your fire energies, all you have to do now is attach return, Magma Basin, and now you're swinging for 330 potentially turn after turn with your different Charizards. And I do like the overall look of this list here. There's not really many crazy tech cards. Like really Manaphy is the only tech if you really want to be honest here. Everything else is just Pokemon search cards and ways at seeing additional cards like the Mysterious Tail Mews, the Burrells. The one sort of red flag I have with this deck list is the draw supporter count, because in total, they're only playing 5 draw supporters between the Ionos and the Serenas that we have here. So I could easily see a world where you're opening with a Charmander and just like a dead hand at that point. But if you can manage to survive those early turns, I think Charizard actually does seem pretty good. The only thing I think you're worried about here is going to be like Qian Pao, obviously like any sort of big water attacker, maybe things like Sableye to pick off your basic Pokemon. And also I do want to highlight their Radiant Pokemon. They are choosing to play the Radiant Charizard. I actually could see a world where you could play this or Greninja. Both of them do seem to make sense, because with Greninja, you do toss away fire energies to power up your Magma Basin. And also with how limited your draw options are, Radiant Greninja could be just a way to help bail you out of those, inevitably clunky early game hands sometimes. But Charizard, of course, you're already playing fire energies. You're already playing Magma Basin. And I do kind of like Charizard here, or Radiant Charizard, paired with the Pokemon Go Charizard. God, how many times have I said Charizard in this part of the video? But I like pairing these two together because it actually does sort of open you up to using this guy a little bit earlier in the game than you otherwise would be able to. So I do think there is a good argument to playing either of these Radiant Pokemon, but they are choosing to go with the Radiant Zard for this list. But like I said, other than the very thin draw supporter count that we have here, I think this looks about like what you would expect for a Charizard EX deck. So next up we have the Electrode deck, which I'm actually pretty excited about. This is kind of like the spiritual successor to the Whimsicott deck back from Vivid Voltage. That was one of my pet decks at the time. I had a lot of fun with that. But if you're not familiar with the Electrode's attack, you discard any number of tools from your Pokemon in play and does 20 plus 40 more for each one that you discard. So if we do discard one from each of our Pokemon, that's what, 260 damage, which is pretty good. That's one-shotting any of the basic Pokemon V and EX running around. And I guess you do one-shot Lugia VSTAR and Paldea VSTAR as well. So your numbers you're hitting for are actually pretty solid, I would say. So inevitably, you're going to run out of steam a little bit in the mid to late game, but that's where the new Snorlax actually helps out Electrode too. So the Snorlax has an ability where it's once during your turn, you can get 2 leftovers from your discard pile and put them back into your hand. So leftovers is this Pokemon tool card they have down here. So no matter what, if you do have Snorlax in play, even though you're chucking away these other tools, you're going to be at least guaranteed 180 damage for turn with your 4 leftovers that you're getting back plus your 20 base damage. But honestly, guys, even if you do start to run out of steam here, I don't even think it's that big of a deal because the Rotom actually has really good synergy, because after you've discarded all of your tool cards and sort of exhausted your damage output in that way, you can start using Rotom V and V-Star to send those tools to the Lost Zone to keep taking big one-hit KOs. They have the Tower of Darkness to maybe discard the single strike tools. They have the single strike Voltorb as well if they're desperate and need to discard that. Also have the Radiant Venusaur, which actually might even be this deck's best Radiant Pokemon the more I'm thinking about it, because after you've thrown down all of your tool cards, you're probably not going to have a very big hand at the end of your turn. So you can use Venusaur to refill it back up to 4. So that seems cool. It doesn't auto-proof you. That's the only downside. And I guess if you can't find space to run like a 1/1 Barrel, this is probably like your next best option here. But of course, the big Achilles heel to this whole Electrode deck is that nothing here really has a lot of HP. And so something like Sableye is just going to absolutely body you. So if you're playing Electrode, you just have to dodge Lost Box and hopefully just beat anything else that crosses your path. So if nothing else, I will at least be having some fun with this on like PTCG Live or something. Okay, so next up we have the Wigglytuff deck. And I do think Wigglytuff EX is actually kind of a deceptively pretty decent card. So its ability, if you have any special energy attached, it gets, I believe, 100 extra HP. So it buffs you all the way up to 350 max HP, which is pretty cool. And then its attack is 3 colorless and it does 90 plus 90 more, I think, if you've played a supporter for your turn. So the big issue though is that you have a 3 energy attack cost. Double Turbo isn't going to power you up, but that is where the other Wigglytuff from Paldea Evolved is going to come in handy, guys, because you can attach Double Turbo energy for turn and then use this Wigglytuff to accelerate your therapeutic energy to finish powering up your EX and be ready to go. And now you're effectively a 350 HP stage 1 that's just hitting for a nice constant like 2-shotting amount of damage. So the one issue I think this list has is that they aren't running any copies of Dunsparce. If you do go against something like a Stonjourner or like an Urshifu or something, they can always one-shot you. But I guess the Mew EX here can help with that a little bit, because well, not so much against Stonjourner, but if you are going against like Single Strike Urshifu or Rapid Strike Urshifu, those guys are going to be Psychic weak, and you can power up Mew VMAX, or sorry, Mew EX with a Double Turbo plus the Wigglytuff here. They also have Radiant Zard, which is a little bit peculiar, but you know, you're a colorless deck, so you can afford to play the couple fire energies here if you do want to. Oh, and I didn't even notice the Share and Scare. This actually seems really good too, because of course, if they do swing on Wigglytuff and they're not a fighting Pokemon and they're not one-shotting you, you can always Share and Scare, re-evolve, slam down Double Turbo, plus Wigglytuff, the therapeutic energy back down. So yeah, this seems pretty solid. I mean, I think you just struggle against any deck that can one-shot you though. Like even outside of fighting decks, we still have Gardevoir, there's Chien-Pao, I mean, even Giratina V-Star maybe. So that's something you do have to worry about. And maybe even playing the, Rigid Band might even be a better tool card. Like I understand you need the Choice Belt to two-shot Pokemon with 330 HP, but you probably just lose to Duraludon either way, if we're being honest. So maybe just going the Rigid Band route might be a little bit better. Well, I guess Choice Belt does help you with Radiant Zard to be able to hit V-Stars for 280. So that seems kind of good. I don't know. Overall, I think the list is pretty decent though. They've got plenty of supporters. They've got a barrel. So if your opponent does try to Iono you in the late game and prevent you from using a supporter to get that damage buff with Wigglytuff. So overall, I think it looks like a pretty solid list for the Wigglytuff deck. But staying with the Stage 1 EX theme for just a minute here, we have Arbok EX. And I will say, I did see a couple of different Arbok lists floating around. It definitely seems like the Japanese haven't nailed down the exact way they want to build this just yet, but I thought this one looked pretty decent here. If you're not familiar with the Arbok, its second attack in particular is actually really strong. For 3 dark does 150, and then you discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand. Well, Technically, your opponent chooses the 2 to discard. Important distinction to make for sure. But the idea, as you guys can imagine, is you just want to disrupt your opponent's hand with cards like Iono or Judge. They're playing, looks like 4 Iono, 1 Judge. So yeah, plenty of hand disruption options. And then maybe in the late game specifically, if you Iono your opponent down to like 2 cards and use this attack on Arbok, if they don't have an attacker on board that can deal with you, I mean, you're kind of just shutting them out of the game at that point and forcing them to just top deck like a research or something to get back in the game. But you can see they're also playing the Snatch Arm that was in the Mew list we looked at earlier. So if they have a Pokemon in their hand, you can actually eliminate 1 of those cards and then force your opponent to get rid of 2 additional. Now, I will say it does seem just a little bit odd they're not running Path to the Peak in this deck. That definitely seems like it would be probably the best stadium for a deck like this, that or Temple of Sinnoh, one or the other, since being able to go like Path, Iono, discard their hands seems like such an oppressive combo. I guess maybe the argument for Beach Court is to Dark Patch, you have to Dark Patch onto the bench, and Beach Court at least gives you a way to promote something with a 1 retreat, like a Mew here or like a Manaphy. Dark Patch to the bench, then freely retreat into your Arbok. So I guess that does make some sense the more I'm talking about it. But I don't know, just intuitively, I feel like I would gravitate towards Path to the Peak, and I'll probably still test that out. But the Beach Court, it does make some sense, but I just kind of want to lock our opponent out of the game. That would be my knee-jerk way to build around Arbok here. But they also do have some other healing cards. They do have the 1 Radiant Serena and the 1 Potion as well. So I'm actually not sure what these cards are for. Like Radiant Serena, I can assume is going to be for Lost Box. But I've got to say, even against Lost Box though, I feel like just Iono discard their hand is good enough. I could be mistaken. But the Potion is definitely the weirder inclusion out of the 2. I have no idea what this is for. Is this for like Ting Lu or something where they're trying to turn off your barrels and you want to have access to your barrels again? I'm not sure exactly. Maybe they didn't know what to include as like their final card in the deck and they're just like, screw it, we're going to play a Potion. And maybe that's going to be relevant at some point. I'm honestly really not sure. But Arbok, I do like this card. And I do think this is one of the more promising new attackers that we're getting in this set for sure. Next up, we have a winning Alakazam EX deck. I know a lot of people are excited about this one. Alakazam is a pretty mechanically interesting card, but also it's our homie Kadabra's first time back in the TCG in like 20 years. So I think a lot of people are just excited to be able to play like an actual proper Stage 2 Alakazam deck again. But if you do need a refresher on this guy, its second attack in particular is the one that's caused sort of the most controversy, or not controversy, but really brought this card the most attention. For 2 Psychic Energy does 120, but we can use this attack even while on the bench. So the idea here is you're going to hide behind various different wall Pokemon, like the Klefkis that we have here to turn off your opponent's abilities on their basics, or maybe like the Mimikyus, and just snipe while you're hiding behind these sort of annoying Pokemon. They have a couple of these other wall Pokemon that I think are really cool additions that I wasn't even thinking about. So the Snorlax has the block ability where your opponent's active can't retreat if this guy is your active. And I really do like this because you can bring up something like a Radiant Greninja if you're going against, let's say, Gardevoir EX, where they don't really play any switching cards. Maybe they play a penny, like a single copy at most. And so you can bring that up with something like a Boss's Orders, and then snipe behind that with your Alakazam EX. So you can still take prizes even while you're trapping these annoying Pokemon in the active. But also they do have the Radiant Jirachi, and this probably honestly is the deck's best Radiant Pokemon because you can throw it up into the active spot, let it get knocked out, and then use its ability to grab any 3 cards, and that can actually set up your whole Alakazam play. Now, they do have the Path to the Peak as their stadium, which I definitely like here. I think this makes a ton of sense. You're just sort of trying to disrupt your opponent while you're sort of chipping away at them with that 120 attack on Alakazam. But you do also have the option of attacking with Alakazam's first attack for like a, to maybe clean up some knockouts at some point. I believe it's 60 plus 30 for every Pokemon your opponent has on the bench, something like that. So they have the 2 double turbos to maybe pull that off, or even maybe go for the big Hail Mary play with Radiant Jirachi. I mean, you're playing this guy already, so you may as well play some double turbos. Maybe you can flip double heads and get like an instant KO or something. So yeah, Alakazam seems really cool. I'm excited for this one. I mean, not just because it's like our first real Stage 2 Alakazam in forever, but it's also just like a really mechanically interesting deck. Being able to attack from the bench is something I don't think I've ever seen. So I'm really hoping that this deck can become something special and be competitive, because it's refreshing to see, again, just mechanically interesting cards like this come out. And for the final deck we're going to check out today, we have a Golem EX deck, which is kind of surprising because Golem, as old of a Pokemon as it is, it just historically never has gotten good cards. Almost every Golem that's come out that I can remember has been utter trash. But this guy finally might be the first good one. So if you're not familiar with it, its first attack, I believe, is 50 for a fighting. And then on your next turn, your attacks do 120 more damage. So not too bad. We can actually just keep spamming this single energy attack over and over to hit for 170. And as you can see, they are playing the 4 copies of Cheryl in the deck. So I think the idea here is you do this 50 damage attack, and then every turn after, you Cheryl, attach fighting, Cheryl, attach fighting over and over, and you just keep spamming 170 while never getting one shot. And even though you're a fighting Pokemon, one thing that's nice about Golem, it's weak to grass, not psychic. So Pokemon like Gardevoir and Mew actually can't even really one-shot this guy. Well, I guess technically Gardevoir can, but generally speaking, it's going to be really difficult for most decks to actually take a one-shot on you. But Golem actually does have another attack here. I believe it's fighting plus DTE. So all you need is one additional attachment after your first attack, and it hits for 180 and I believe goes through resistance. So after you use this first attack, on your next one, for just a DTE, you're hitting for 300, which is actually pretty insane. And I think the engine that they're playing for this deck is really interesting overall. As you can see, their only draw supporters in the entire deck are going to be 3 Avery, which is definitely a good card in like the matchups that you're kind of worried about, which I would think are going to be like Gardevoir, Qianpao, maybe like Lost Tina. Like those are really the only big one-shot decks I can think of that you're afraid of. Avery is very good against all of those, but still kind of odd to see there's no Iono, there's no research. They actually play more copies of Cheryl than they do supporters that can draw them cards, but they are leaning pretty heavily on Bidoof and Burrell. So 3/3 Burrell plus the 2 Mysterious Tail Mews. I think this card does stick out to me as being like a little bit odd because they're not playing Beach Court and they only play the 1 Escape Rope. So like it seems like it's very difficult to actually use Mew as a reliable pivot Pokemon. Also, I'm not sure how I feel about the 2 Squavit here. Like 1 makes sense because you can stick your hand at the bottom to be able to draw more cards with Burrell, but 2 definitely strikes me as overkill here, I have to say. So guys, I gotta say, Golem, I know it's struck out a lot in the past, but this might finally be our first decent one. But guys, that is going to do it for all of the decks we are going to be looking at today. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this video too, there still were a ton of other decks that were winning over there in Japan. So I definitely encourage you guys to go check out PokemonCard.io and see all of the winners for the entire month. And if you guys did enjoy today's content, as always, remember to leave a like on the video. Or if you're feeling maybe a little extra generous, you can always become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg. or pick up some merch at rarecandytcg.com. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.